Two nations that never shared a language, never shared a border, and by almost every account never sat down at the same fire, somehow ended up telling the same story about these mountains. The Cherokee called it one thing, the Shawnee called it something else. But when you lay their warnings side by side and actually read them, they describe the same place, the same danger, and the same instruction. Do not dig there. Do not build there. Do not wake what sleeps under the Blue Ridge. For 200 years we were told these were just legends, just stories to frighten children away from dangerous ground. And then people went looking, and the ground turned out to be far stranger than the stories. If you are the kind of person who wants the real version of this, the part that got quietly left out of the textbooks, go ahead and subscribe right now. This channel goes to the places the official history skips over, and this is one you are going to want to watch all the way to the end. It only takes a second, and it tells the algorithm to keep showing you the rest. Let me start with the land itself, because the land is the first piece of evidence. The Blue Ridge is old, not old the way a building is old. Old the way something is old when it was already ancient before anyone thought to write anything down. Geologists will tell you these are among the oldest mountains on the planet, worn down across stretches of time we cannot picture, until they became the soft blue waves you see today. Once, they may have stood as tall as the Himalayas do now. What is left is the root of a mountain range, the part that was too deep and too stubborn to erode. That haze that gives them their name comes from the trees themselves, releasing something into the air that scatters the light into that blue smoke hanging in the valleys. It looks like the most peaceful place in America, and maybe that is exactly why nobody looked too closely for so long. Because underneath that peaceful blue surface there is a record, and the people who lived here longest, who watched these ridges through more generations than we can count, left behind a set of instructions. Not a myth, not a fairy tale, instructions. And the strangest part is that two separate nations left behind versions of the same ones. The Cherokee homeland stretched across what is now western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and up into the edges of Virginia. This was the heart of their world. Their mother town, a place called Kittua, sat along the Tuckasegee River, and from that single mound the entire nation traced its origin. The Shawnee were different. The Shawnee were travelers. Their history is a history of movement, of being pushed and pulling up roots and settling and moving again, across a territory so wide that at times they seem to be everywhere and nowhere at once, from the Ohio country down into the southern mountains and back. These two peoples had contact. Trade happened, war happened, but they were not the same. They did not share a cosmology. They did not share a founding story. Their languages come from entirely different families, so different that a Cherokee speaker and a Shawnee speaker could not understand a single word the other said without an interpreter standing between them. And yet there is a warning that shows up in both traditions. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let me give you the Cherokee side first, because it survived in the most detail, and because historians have argued about it for the better part of 2 centuries. The Cherokee told the early European settlers something strange. They said they were not the first people to live in these mountains. They said that when their ancestors arrived, someone was already here. A people who were pale, a people with light skin and, according to the stories, eyes that could not handle sunlight. They could see in the dark, the Cherokee said. They moved at night and hid during the day. The Cherokee called them the moon-eyed people. This is not something invented for a video. It is documented. In the late 1700s, a man named Benjamin Smith Barton wrote down what the Cherokee told him about a race of people who had lived in the region before them, people who could not see well in daylight, people who were eventually driven out or destroyed. The story was old even then. It was already a legend passed down through generations when the colonists showed up asking questions, and it did not stay a single isolated account. Other observers, dealing with the Cherokee at different times and in different places, came back with versions of the same thing. Pale people, bearded in some tellings, small in some, tall in others, blind in the day, builders, driven west or driven underground, or wiped out in a war so old the Cherokee themselves treated it as ancient history. And herein where it stops being just a story. Because the Cherokee did not only say these people existed, they said these people built things, and some of those things are still standing. Go to the top of Fort Mountain in northern Georgia, and you will find a wall. A long, low wall of piled stone that runs for roughly 850 feet across the summit. In places, it is still several feet high. It zigzags. It has pits or depressions built into it at regular intervals, evenly spaced, deliberate. Nobody knows who built it. The Cherokee, when they were asked, said they did not. They said it was there before them. They said it was the work of the moon-eyed people, the pale ones who came before. The official position for a long time was that maybe it was ceremonial, maybe a fortification, maybe something thrown up by an earlier group we simply do not have a name for. The plaque at the state park hedges every direction at once, but no one can tell you with certainty who stacked those stones, or when, or why. It just sits there at the top of a mountain, a wall built by hands that left no other trace. And Fort Mountain is not alone. Across the Appalachians and the country around them there are these anomalies. Stone walls running along high ground, stone chambers dug into hillsides, standing stones. There is a place in Tennessee people have long called the Old Stone Fort, an enclosure of earth and stone whose purpose and builders remain debated, over and over, the same shape of a mystery. Careful stonework, on a scale and of an age that does not sit comfortably in the accepted timeline, and no confident name attached to the hands that made it. And that is the pattern you start to notice. The people who lived here longest kept pointing at things and saying, "We did not make that. Someone was here before us." The mounds are the same story, only bigger. All through the southern mountains and the river valleys that drain out of them, and up through the Ohio country the Shawnee knew, there are earthworks, great constructed hills of earth, some of them enormous, arranged in shapes that took staggering amounts of coordinated labor. There is one complex far to the north, at a place called Cahokia, whose largest mound covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Sit with that. In the American interior there is an earthen structure with a bigger footprint than the Great Pyramid, and most people who live in this country have never once heard its name. Some of the mounds are cones, some are flat-top platforms that plainly once held buildings on top, and some, the strangest ones, are shaped like animals and serpents and birds, shapes you can only really read from the air, which raises a quiet question nobody likes to sit with. Who exactly were those shapes built to be seen by? When Europeans first found the mounds, they refused to believe the ancestors of the native peoples had built them. They invented an entire imaginary race, the so-called mound builders, a lost civilization that had supposedly vanished and been replaced by the tribes. That theory got used to justify terrible things, because if some noble lost race built the mounds and the current natives had wiped them out, then the current natives had no special claim to the ground. Eventually that racist theory was torn down, and rightly so. But watch what happened in the tearing down. Because even the Cherokee, living right next to some of these mounds, had traditions saying certain of them were built by others, by the old ones, by a people who came before. It was not only white settlers who claimed an earlier people had lived here. The tribes said it too, and when the racist version got thrown out, the tribe's own testimony got swept into the same bin and thrown out with it, filed under myth. Do not look here. 2 layers. That is what the Cherokee were describing. A world with 2 layers. The one they lived in, and an older one underneath it, left behind by people who were gone. There was a name they used for the beings tied to those hidden places. The little people, the Unwitsunzdi, who lived in the rock and the laurel and the caves, and who could help you or ruin you depending on how you treated their ground. Follow them home uninvited and you could be turned around in the woods, made to forget your way, lost within sight of a trail you had walked 100 times. And the Nunahi, the ones who never die, whose townhouses sat inside the tallest mountains. Whatever else these traditions were, they were a map of which ground belonged to people and which belonged to something else. And the something else was always down, always inside, always under. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what both nations were actually warning about. The names the elders gave the ones who came before, the exact ridges and mounds they marked as never to be opened, and the council record where the warning was set down in their own words. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue, because the Shawnee had their own version, and the Shawnee version is the one almost nobody talks about. The Shawnee were a migrating people, and migrating peoples carry their history differently than people rooted to one spot. A rooted people ties its stories to a single mountain, a single river, a single mound. A travelling people ties its stories to a journey, and the Shawnee journey, in their own telling, kept bringing them back to the southern mountains, again and again, across centuries, as if something about this range mattered to them in a way that outlasted any single village they built. They were scattered across a huge sweep of the continent, and yet this old blue wall of stone kept pulling on their memory. In the Shawnee tradition there is also a memory of a people who came before. Not the moon-eyed people by name. The Shawnee did not use the Cherokee word, but they described the same thing. An ancient people, a people who had built and then vanished. In some of the accounts tied to the Shawnee and their neighbours, these earlier people were described as pale, as bearded, and as unusually large. A race that had held the river valleys and the mountain country, and had been driven out or wiped out in a great war before the Shawnee themselves took the land. Their works were still standing when the Shawnee arrived. They walked past those ruins, and camped near them, and, crucially, warned about them. There is a detail in some of these accounts that is easy to miss and hard to forget once you have caught it. The earlier people were not simply gone, they were driven, west, or down, or into the dark. The language of the traditions is the language of a war that ended in removal, one people pushing another off the land and inheriting what they left behind, which means that long before the marches of the 1800s, long before any European set foot here, this same landscape had already witnessed at least one erasure of one people by another. The Shawnee and the Cherokee were not describing a peaceful handover. They were describing a conquest so old it had hardened into legend, and a warning that came attached to the ruins of the conquered. Because that is the part that lines up. Both nations did not just remember that someone came before, both nations attached a warning to it. The Cherokee said, "Do not disturb certain places." There were ridges you did not build on. There were sites where you left the ground alone. There was a category of place that was not cursed exactly, but was understood to belong to the old world underneath, and you did not go poking into that world if you were wise. The Shawnee had the same instinct about the same kind of place. Certain sites were left alone, certain ground was understood to be older than the people, and the prudent did not test it. And this reticence was not unique to those two nations. All across the mound-building country, the tribes who lived among the earthworks tended to treat them as sacred or as dangerous, as places tied to the dead and to powers that predated the living. And the Shawnee had something the Cherokee did not, something that turns this from quiet folklore into a documented event you can look up. The Shawnee produced a prophet. In the early 1800s, a Shawnee holy man rose up among his people, the brother of a war leader whose name a lot of Americans still recognize from history class. The prophet had fallen, drunk and broken, into what people around him thought was death, and then he came back with a message. He preached a return to the old ways, a rejection of nearly everything the newcomers had brought, and he spoke of a coming catastrophe, a sign that would prove the old warnings were real. He told the tribes that the earth itself would move, that the ground would shake and the rivers would run backward, and the sky would give a signal that could not be ignored. He told them to watch for it. And then, in the winter that followed, the ground did move. A sequence of earthquakes struck the middle of the continent so violently that the great river ran backward for a time, that church bells rang hundreds of miles away, that new lakes opened where solid ground had been, that the land rolled in visible waves. It was one of the most powerful earthquake sequences ever recorded on this continent, and it landed almost exactly as the prophet said it would. There had been a great comet burning in the sky that same year, the kind of sign people in every century have read as an omen. To the tribes watching, the prophecy had come true in the ground under their feet. You can call all of that a coincidence, and skeptics do, and they have their arguments. But sit inside the Shawnee frame for a second and see how it looks from there. A people who carried a memory of an older world beneath this one. A people who warned that the ground held something that must not be disturbed. And a prophet who stood up and said the underneath was going to make itself known, and then the underneath did exactly that, on a scale that terrified everyone who felt it, natives and settlers alike. And the prophet's message did not stay with the Shawnee, it spread. Runners carried it out to other nations across the interior, tribe to tribe, until a huge swath of the continent was watching the sky and the ground for the sign he had promised. When the earth finally convulsed that winter, it did not confirm the warning for one people. It confirmed it for many, all at once, across an enormous territory. For a brief and terrifying moment, the old memory of a dangerous world beneath this one stopped being folklore and became the most urgent news on the continent. And then the moment passed, the ground went still, the settlers wrote it up as a natural curiosity, and the meaning the tribes had read into it was quietly filed away with everything else. For the Shawnee, that was not a random natural disaster. That was the lower world speaking. That was confirmation of everything the old people had been saying about the ground you were standing on. The earth was not solid, the earth was a lid, and under the right conditions the lid moved. Hold that thought, because it connects straight back to the Cherokee side. The Cherokee describe a world suspended between an upper realm and a lower realm, a middle world hanging on cords from the sky vault, always at risk of sinking back into the water and the chaos it came from. Beneath the surface, in their telling, was another world, the mirror of ours, out of season with it, and full of powerful and dangerous beings. That is not a vague spiritual poem. That is a description of a world that is not permanent, a world that sits on top of something older and more dangerous, a world that could be pulled back under if the balance broke. Two nations, two completely different ways of saying it. One says the lower world must stay sealed. The other says the ground itself will move when the balance breaks. But both of them are describing the same architecture, a surface we live on, a buried world beneath it, and a boundary between the two that is thinner than we would like to believe. There is also the matter of the giants, and this is where both nations line up in a way that is genuinely hard to wave off. Cherokee tradition is full of them. Judaculla himself is a giant, the slant-eyed master of the mountains and the game. There are stories of a whole tribe of large beings who came from the west and fought the Cherokee before moving on. And Shawnee tradition, along with the traditions of other nations across the eastern woodlands, carries the same memory. A prior race of large people, powerful, dangerous, and gone. For a long time this got filed under pure myth, the way people assume every culture just invents giants. But then you go back to those mound excavations, back to the crates and the drawers and the newspaper reports from the 1800s and the county histories written by earnest local men who had no reason to lie, and you find the same details surfacing over and over. Skeletons described by the people who dug them up as far larger than they had any business being, 7 feet, 8 feet. In a few of the wilder reports, taller. Some of these accounts are tied to serious survey work, not just tabloids. There is a report connected to the Great Federal Mound Survey of the 1880s describing a skeleton of unusual size pulled from a mound. Different states, different decades, different diggers. The same detail. In the mounds, sometimes, they found the very large dead. And here is the part that sharpens it. Where are those bones now? Go looking, and they are gone. Not on display. Not in a lab. Not in any public collection where you can walk up and measure them yourself. The remains that were described in print at the moment they came out of the ground cannot be produced today. The official answer is that the reports were exaggerated, or misidentified, or hoaxed, or simply lost across the decades. Ordinary bones, ordinary loss, nothing to see, and maybe every single one of those accounts across 100 years was a mistake or a lie. But hold them next to what the Shawnee said, giants, a large, pale people who held the land before, and next to what the Cherokee said, the builders who came before, and the coincidences start to stack in a way that is hard to keep waving off. The physical evidence that might have settled the question is exactly the evidence that vanished into storage and never came back out. That is either the most consistent coincidence in American archaeology, or it is a pattern. And this channel is very interested in patterns. Picture how one of these finds actually went. A crew opens a mound in some river county in the middle of the 1800s. They hit bone. The bones are big, bigger than anyone standing there has ever seen, and someone measures them, and someone writes it down, in a letter, in a local paper, in the county record. For a while, the find is real and local and talked about, and then the trail goes cold. The bones get boxed and shipped off somewhere, or handed to a private collector, or simply set aside in a back room, and the next time anyone goes looking, they are nowhere. No specimen, no number, no shelf. Just the old written account, sitting there, describing something that supposedly never existed, waiting for someone to decide whether the writer was a liar, a fool, or a witness. Now, a skeptic hears all this and says, of course. Every culture has sacred sites. Every culture has taboo ground. This is just normal human religion, and you are stitching two ordinary traditions together and pretending you found a conspiracy. And that would be a fair point. It really would, if the warnings were vague. If the Cherokee said spirits live in the mountains, and the Shawnee said spirits live in the mountains, then fine, that is two peoples having a similar instinct about a dramatic landscape. Nothing strange about it. But the warnings are not vague. That is the thing. When you get into the detail, they stop describing spirits in a general sense, and they start describing something specific, something structural. They start describing, and I want to be careful how I say this, a thing that was built, that was buried, and that was not supposed to come back up. Let me show you what I mean by looking at a rock. In Jackson County, North Carolina, sitting in a field in the Blue Ridge, there is a large soapstone boulder covered in carvings. It is called Judaculla rock. The carvings are old, weathered, and to this day nobody has translated them, because nobody knows what system they belong to, if it is a writing system at all. There are hundreds of markings crowded onto that one stone. Figures, lines, cupules, shapes, and a 7-fingered handprint that has become the rock's most famous feature. 7 fingers, not 5. People walk past that detail every day without letting it land. The Cherokee name behind the rock refers to a giant, a slant-eyed master of the game animals who lived in the high mountains at a place whose name translates to something like the place where he jumped down. He was said to leap from a mountain called Tennessee Bald and land right there on the rock, leaving his handprint pressed into the stone. That is the surface version. A giant, a leap, a handprint. But dig underneath the folklore and you find something more interesting. Cherokee tradition treats the rock not as decoration but as a boundary marker, a line, a place where the giant's domain began and the ordinary human world ended. On one side you were fine. On the other side you were in the territory of something older and larger than you, and you conducted yourself accordingly. A boundary marker. Think about what that implies. A boundary implies two territories. It implies that someone, at some point, needed to mark where the safe world stopped and the other world started. You do not carve hundreds of symbols into a boulder and treat it as a sacred line for no reason. Something was on the other side of that line, and the Shawnee, hundreds of miles away, moving through their own set of forbidden sites, carried the memory of the same kind of boundary, places you did not cross, ground that belonged to the ones who came before. So now we have two nations, unrelated languages, separate origins, and both of them are pointing at the Blue Ridge and saying the same three things. There were people here before us. They built things that are still here. And there are places where their world touches ours, and you do not go into those places. Three claims, carried by two peoples who agreed on almost nothing else, pointed at the same range of ancient blue mountains. Before we move on to the next teaching, stop for a second. What you just heard about the boundary markers is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original settler accounts, the identical warning, the buried foundations. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, here is where the story turns, and where I have to bring in something a lot of people are not ready to hear. Everything I have described so far fits, more or less, inside what a mainstream historian would accept as folklore. Legends of earlier peoples, sacred sites, unexplained walls and carvings. A cautious historian would shrug and say, interesting, unexplained, probably has a mundane answer we just have not found yet. But there is another layer, and it connects the Blue Ridge warnings to something much bigger. Because the Cherokee and the Shawnee were not the only ones who noticed that the land here had two histories. The people who came after them, the surveyors, the engineers, The men who mapped this country and carved it into counties and property lines ran into the same thing, and their reaction was very different. The Cherokee left the old places alone. The men with the survey chains did not. Look at the record of how this region got mapped and settled, and you find something strange in the timing. There is a period, roughly the first half of the 1800s, when an enormous amount of the older history of this land seems to simply drop out of the account. Gold was found in the North Georgia mountains, right in the heart of the Cherokee country, and the rush that followed put a price on the land that no treaty was going to survive. The native nations were removed, violently, on the forced marches we now remember by name, marched 1,000 miles west at gunpoint. And in the vacuum left behind, a new story got written about who had been here and what they had built. The mounds got explained away, the walls got explained away, the carvings got labelled curiosities. An entire prior world got flattened into a footnote in a single generation, and the only people who could have contradicted the new story were gone. And the rewriting was not lazy, it was thorough. New names went on old places, new origin dates got assigned to structures nobody had actually dated. The tribes who had lived among the works for centuries were recast as recent arrivals with no deep claim, and the works themselves were handed to a vague, safely extinct past that could not talk back. Within a generation or two, the official story of this land was complete, internally consistent, printed in books, and taught in schools, and it had a clean, empty space exactly where the older civilization used to be. That is the unnerving thing about a rewrite done well. It does not look like a gap, it looks like the whole picture. You have to already suspect something is missing before you can see the shape of the whole. And this is where the Blue Ridge story stops being just an Appalachian legend and starts rhyming with something people have started calling, for lack of a better word, the reset. Because all across the world there is this same pattern, an older layer of construction, more advanced or at least more mysterious than it should be. Structures nobody can quite account for. And then a moment, somewhere in the not-so-distant past, when the official history seems to restart, when the record gets thin, when a whole prior civilization gets compressed into vague phrases like the ancients, or the mound builders, or the ones who came before. A layer of the world gets buried, literally and in the records, and a new story gets written on top of it. And once you learn to see that pattern, you start seeing it in a lot of places that have nothing to do with each other. Let me strip the drama out of that word, reset, and show you the plain version, because the plain version is more unsettling than the hype. The plain version is this. Somewhere in the last few hundred years, in a lot of places around the world at roughly the same time, the ground floors of very old buildings ended up below street level. You have seen this and never thought about it. A grand old structure where the original front door is now half a story underground, where you walk down a little stair to reach what used to be the entrance, where the windows at your feet were once at eye level. The official answer is that cities rise over time, that dirt accumulates, that debris in construction slowly lift the street, and that this is completely normal. And sometimes it plainly is. But the sheer amount of it, the number of buildings all over the world sitting in their own filled-in basements, is the observation that started people asking whether something buried a whole layer of the world in a hurry, all at once, and whether the tidy explanations came afterward to smooth it over. And it is not only the doorways below the sidewalk, it is the mud. In city after city there are old records and images of buildings dug out of packed earth and silt that had reached the first floor windows, hauled back into daylight as if some great flow had come through and buried the lower stories in a single event, not a slow century of settling dust. And it is the buildings themselves, the enormous, ornate, impossibly detailed palaces of stone and glass thrown up for the great international expositions of the 18 and 1900s, which the official story says were raised in a matter of months out of temporary plaster and then deliberately torn down right afterward, built fast, out of almost nothing, by a society we are told had far less than we do, and then demolished before anyone could ask how. Maybe that is exactly what happened. Or maybe some of those buildings were already standing, older than the fair that borrowed them, and the fair was the cover story for why they were there, and the demolition was the cover story for making them go away. Either way, the shape of it is the same one the Cherokee kept pointing at. grand old works and a tidy modern explanation stretched thin across the top of them. Now, bring that back to the Blue Ridge. The Cherokee described a buried layer, an older world underneath, sealed off, dangerous to reopen. The mounds are, quite literally, earth piled over something, over chambers and over the dead. The walls and terraces are stone that predates the people who found them, and the removal of the native nations happens to line up with the exact window when this continent's official history gets rewritten, simplified, and stripped of its older layer. Whatever a reset is, whatever you want to call it, the Blue Ridge shows the same fingerprints. A buried older layer, a thin and suspicious record, and a warning from the people who were here longest not to dig it back up. And the architecture puzzle cuts deeper than old doorways. Think about the star forts. All over the world, on nearly every continent, there are these geometric star-shaped fortifications, built to an almost identical design, sharing engineering principles across cultures that supposedly never spoke to each other and could not have shared a blueprint. The official explanation is that they were a military innovation, a clever way to deal with cannon fire, and that the design spread naturally because it worked. Maybe, but the sheer uniformity of it, the way the exact same complex geometry shows up in places on opposite sides of the Earth, is precisely the kind of thing the Blue Ridge warnings hint at on a smaller, quieter scale. A shared design, a shared body of knowledge, a prior world that was far more connected than we are ever told it was. The stonework tells the same story if you know where to look. Canals and cut stone foundations and long straight walls turn up in places the accepted history says held only scattered villages and simple tools. Terraces and waterworks that would take real engineering to lay out get waved off as the casual work of people who supposedly had no writing, no wheel, and no metal to speak of. Every time, the accepted answer is to make the builders smaller and the timeline shorter and the achievement more modest until the thing standing in front of you finally fits inside the box you were handed. But you can only shrink a thing so far before the shrinking itself becomes the evidence. When the explanation has to keep bending to avoid the object, at some point you have to wonder whether the object is trying to tell you the explanation is wrong. And there is a quieter version of the same puzzle scattered through the older stonework of the eastern mountains. Techniques of dry stacked stone, of terracing, of careful fitting of heavy blocks that show up in places where the accepted history says there should only have been simple settlement and simple tools. The Cherokee answer to who built with such skill was always the same. Not us, the ones before. And the modern answer has always been the same too. Shrink the structures down, reclassify them. Insist they are younger and simpler and more ordinary than they look. Somebody is trimming the past to fit the story. The question worth sitting with is who, and why, and what exactly got trimmed off and thrown away. The people who go deepest into this call the buried civilization by an old name that used to appear on maps and then quietly disappeared from them. For centuries, on maps drawn by respected European cartographers, in atlases and encyclopedias, a vast territory across the northern part of the world carried a single label. It was there in map after map, edition after edition. And then, sometime in the 1800s, it faded off the maps and out of the reference books, and the mainstream explanation is that it was only ever a loose word for a huge region Europeans did not know well. A catch-all for a lot of different peoples they lumped together, just a placeholder for the unknown, they say, that fell out of use once better information came along. But a lot of people looked at those old maps and asked a different question. What if it was not a placeholder? What if it named something real? A unified and capable civilization that existed within the last several hundred years and was then erased, not just from the land but from the story of the land, its buildings reassigned to other cultures, its history rewritten, its very existence turned into a vague geographic footnote so that no one would ever go looking for it. Whether or not you accept the full theory, and I am not asking you to, you cannot deny the core observation that started it, which is simply this. There are places all over the earth where the buildings are older and stranger than the history books can explain, and where the explanation we were handed does not match what is standing in front of us. The Blue Ridge is one of those places, and the Cherokee and the Shawnee were the last two peoples who remembered the truth of it clearly enough to warn about it. And notice when the label vanished. It did not fade out slowly across many centuries. It went quiet in roughly the same window, the 1800s, when this continent was having its own history rewritten and its own older layer buried. One old civilization gets scrubbed off the maps of the far side of the world. Another older presence gets erased from the story of these mountains. Different continents, different peoples, the same century, the same quiet editorial hand pressing down on anything that did not fit a new and simpler account of who had ever built anything worth building. You can call that a coincidence of intellectual fashion, scholars politely updating their terms as knowledge improved, or you can notice that the terms updated in exactly the direction that made a prior world easier to forget. Look at how these sites are treated right now, today, because the present tense tells you something the past cannot. Go looking for the most anomalous of these places, and you notice a quiet, consistent pattern. Access is complicated. Some sit on protected land with restrictions that go beyond the ordinary. Some had their most interesting features studied once, briefly, decades ago, and then declared closed and settled and never seriously revisited. The oversized remains from the old excavations are, as a rule, not on public display and not available for independent examination by anyone who might measure them and ask hard questions. And the claims that a given site might be older or larger or stranger than the accepted timeline allows are met, again and again, with the same swift institutional certainty. The same we already know what this is. The same nothing to see here, move along. Maybe every one of those closures is justified. Maybe each is a case of genuine experts correctly shutting down a bad idea before it wastes everyone's time. But step back and look at the whole set at once, all of it together, and the consistency starts to feel less like a series of accidents and more like a policy. It is always the same shape. Something in these mountains looks older or larger or stranger than it should. Someone points it out. And the door closes fast and stays closed. The Cherokee said, "Do not open these places." The strange part, the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up, is that the modern world, in its own bureaucratic and paperwork-driven way, seems oddly determined to keep them closed too, just without ever explaining why in terms that anyone on the outside can actually check. And it is worth being precise about how this actually feels from the inside, because it is not a movie. There are no men in dark rooms burning documents. It is far more ordinary than that, and far more effective. It is a permit that takes years to get. It is a study that was done once decades ago and is now treated as final. It is a box of remains that is simply not available for viewing right now. It is a polite letter explaining that the site has been thoroughly assessed, and there is nothing further worth investigating. No single one of those is sinister. Any one of them, on its own, is just paperwork. It is only when you line up dozens of them, all pointing the same way, all closing the same kind of door, that the ordinariness itself starts to look like the method. That is where the two eras finally rhyme. The old people sealed these sites with story and taboo, with warnings passed mouth to ear for centuries. The new people, after breaking those seals and hauling off whatever they found inside, sealed them again with paperwork and silence and lost inventory numbers. Different tools, same result. The ground stays closed, the contents stay out of sight, and the public stays about as uninformed as it was before, only now without even the warning to guide it. Let me tell you what happened to the warning itself, because that is the last piece, and it is the darkest one. Warnings only work if they get passed down. A warning is a chain, one generation handing it to the next, over and over, for as long as the danger lasts. Break the chain, and the warning dies, and the danger is still sitting there, but nobody knows to avoid it anymore. That is the real horror at the center of this whole story. Not the buried thing, the broken chain, because the removals of the 1800s did exactly that. They broke the chain. When you march a people off their land at gunpoint, when you scatter them 1,000 miles from the mountains their entire memory is anchored to, when you separate the elders who hold the old knowledge from the young people who are supposed to receive it and carry it forward, you do not just steal land. You cut the wire that was carrying the warning down through time, and the Shawnee, pushed and scattered across their own long, brutal century of removals, had their chain cut too. Two separate transmissions of the same warning, both severed inside the same few decades. Think about what actually died when those chains were cut. Not just a story, a working body of knowledge, which specific ridges to stay off, which springs and coves and balds were tied to the old works, and which ground was safe. How to read this landscape the way people who had lived on it for 1,000 years could read it. The warning was the compressed, memorable, hand-me-down version of all of that, the part built to survive the generations, and it was carried by the elders precisely because the elders were the ones who still held the rest. So when the elders were marched away and scattered and died far from the mountains their knowledge was anchored to, the warning did not just lose its keepers, it lost its meaning. And it faded, the wire was cut, and the current it once carried stopped flowing. A caution with no context left behind is just a strange old saying, easy to smile at and easier to ignore, and that is very close to the state in which the last fragments of it reached us, stripped of everything that would have told us it was real. The people who did the cutting were not interested in the warning, they could not even hear it. They wanted the land, the timber, the gold in the Georgia hills, the farms and the roads, and the future they were sure they were building. So they dug where the Cherokee said not to dig. They built where the Shawnee said not to build. They cracked open the mounds looking for relics and treasure, hauled off the stones for their own walls and foundations, ploughed the sacred ground flat for corn, and mapped their new property lines right over the old boundaries, as if those boundaries had never meant anything. And then they wrote a history in which none of the old warnings had ever existed at all. And here we are, generations later, living on top of all of it. Most of us have never heard a single word about any of this. We drive the parkway through the most peaceful blue mountains in the country, we stop at the overlooks, we take the photographs, and we have absolutely no idea what the last people who truly understood this place were trying so desperately to tell whoever came next. I promised I would be honest about where the record ends and the speculation begins, and we are deep in the speculation now, so let me be plain and lay the two columns side by side. On the solid side, there are real, recorded oral traditions from two rival nations describing an earlier Pale people. There are real stone structures those tribes said they did not build and that no one can confidently explain. There are real earthworks of staggering scale. There are real contemporary reports of oversized remains that can no longer be produced. And there is a real, documented pattern of the establishment inventing a false lost race theory and then, in correcting it, burying the tribe's own testimony along with the lie. Those are the bricks, and they are solid. On the other side, there is no confirmed lost global empire in the academic record. There is a real old map label and a real disappearance of it, with a mundane explanation attached. There is no confirmed race of pale giants in the archaeological record. What the researchers do is take the solid bricks and arrange them into a wall, and the shape of that wall is a civilization that was deliberately erased. You do not have to accept the whole wall to be genuinely disturbed by the bricks. And anyone who tells you they know for absolute certain, either that the empire was real or that there is nothing here at all, is selling you something. But here is the thing that keeps me up at night about this particular story. It is the agreement folklore drifts. Stories change in the telling, they borrow from their neighbours, they bend toward whatever the teller wants them to mean. So for two peoples who were enemies, who did not share a language, who had every reason in the world to tell a different story, to independently arrive at the same warning about the same mountains, one of only two things can possibly be true. Either they inherited it from a common source older than their rivalry, a shared memory from a time before they ever split into enemies, or they were both describing something so real, so physically and undeniably present in that landscape, that neither of them could tell the story any other way, because the walls were right there in front of them, and the mounds were right there, and the memory of who made them was still too fresh to distort. Both of those possibilities point in the exact same direction, backward, to something older than the Cherokee, older than the Shawnee, older than the rivalry between them. Something that was here, that built in stone and earth on a scale we still cannot fully explain, that was described in both traditions as pale and different and gone, and that left behind a warning strong enough to survive centuries of open war between the very people who kept carrying it. And that warning, stripped of every last layer, comes down to a single instruction that both nations tried to hand to whoever came next. Something was here before you. It left its marks all through these mountains. Do not dig them up. Do not disturb what it left behind. because you do not understand what it was, and you do not understand why it is gone. We dug them up anyway. We flattened the mounds for cornfields. We opened the graves for relics and sold what we found. We carted off the bones and lost them in basements and storerooms. We paved the effigies and quarried the walls, and turned the sacred high places into scenic overlooks with parking lots and gift shops. Everything the two nations told us not to do, we did, thoroughly and casually and without a second thought, across about 200 years. Maybe it was all metaphor. Maybe the lower world and the sealed boundaries and the pale ones underneath were a beautiful, sophisticated way of encoding a hard-won truth, a way of saying certain ground should never be broken and certain balances should never be tested. And given everything we have done to these mountains since, the strip mines and the clear cuts and the flooded valleys, that would be its own kind of warning, and we ignored that one too. Or maybe it was not metaphor at all. Maybe two nations who never shared a language were describing, as literally and as carefully as they knew how, a real thing in a real place that a third group came along and pried open without ever once understanding what it was. I do not know which of those is true, and I think anyone who claims to know for certain is not being honest with you, but I know what the record shows. Two unrelated peoples, the same warning, real structures nobody can explain, a history rewritten in a single violent generation, and a chain of memory that was deliberately, systematically cut right at the moment it mattered most. The Cherokee and the Shawnee did their part. They remembered, and they warned, for as long as anyone on earth would let them. The very least we can do, standing here on top of all of it, is finally stop pretending we never heard them. So if this is the kind of history you want more of, the real layer underneath the one we were handed in school, subscribe and stay with this channel, because the next place we are going makes the Blue Ridge look like a warm-up. The moon-eyed people were only one remnant. There are others, in other mountains, on other continents, all telling the same buried story, and we are going to find every last one of them. There is a document that ties all of this together, linked in the description, with the sources laid out so you can walk the trail yourself and check every step. Grab it, read it, and decide for yourself what the old people were really trying to say. I will see you in the next one.